Hello, I'm Tony and welcome to Elaborated Input. I would like to begin with what I think is the most important question that as language instructors we should never stop asking ourselves, which is, are they really learning? Now, in order to answer this question, we need to at the very least have an idea about what learning in the context of languages actually means. When we talk about learning a language, we are not talking about remembering what they are taught, because that type of short-term memory does very little for their long-term proficiency. We're actually talking about language acquisition. Therefore, to talk about learning a language, we need to reframe the conversation around acquiring the language, because that opens the door to understanding. Now, second language acquisition for now can simply be described as an unconscious or implicit process of picking up a language in a very similar way to how the first language was learned. In the process of learning a first language, the primary focus for the learner was meaning and understanding. The child was just trying to understand what the parent was conveying or wishing for them to do. And through a repetition of what the parent was saying over time, often in different situations, the child starts making form-meaning connections, which is a more practical definition of second language acquisition. So this means that without even thinking about it, in other words, implicitly, the learner made a connection subconsciously between the language, the words, and the grammar, and whatever the intended meaning was. Those two things formed meaning and became bound together in the learner's mind. That, explained very simply, is what we're talking about when we say language acquisition. Therefore, to repeat, a good practical definition of second language acquisition is the implicit process of making form-meaning connections. If you have ever wondered what implicit knowledge is, try asking a native speaker to explain aspects of their language to you and just watch them squirm for an answer. They will struggle because they didn't explicitly study the language as an object. It was mostly acquired implicitly. So returning to today's central question, are they really learning? You may be noticing with your learners that even though they have spent a long time practicing and learning a particular form, that whenever there's a time to communicate, that language is simply unavailable to them, or there are lots of mistakes that you thought you had already solved in the classroom. Even you had evidence of that. That is very likely because you are expecting them to use explicit knowledge, which is this idea that they have been taught, so they should remember, right? Unfortunately, languages do not work like other school subjects where knowledge can simply be taught and remembered. For learners to be able to communicate, and that should be our primary focus, don't forget, they need to be able to draw upon a data bank of implicit knowledge, in other words, their linguistic system. And if that implicit knowledge is not there, then it doesn't get used for communication. It really doesn't matter how much or how recently they have been directly taught the desired target language. There's another important feature to language acquisition that is very important for us to acknowledge at this stage. If we can go back again to how we learned our first language, when the young infant learner is being spoken to by his or her parent, focusing on meaning and understanding. Yes, there is a lot of repetition and pattern recognition going on, but the parent in that scenario has to modify how they communicate with the infant. They need to simplify the communication. They need to make it more comprehensible. So the parents would have simplified the language. They would have slowed down speech. They would have also provided contextual support to make the input more comprehensible. So in addition to slowing down speech and even using graded language, they're likely to use body language to show what they are talking about, perhaps pointing to the object or demonstrating with their hands what is being talked about. And all these things combined with the situation itself helps to provide as much contextual support as possible in order to give more meaning for the infant to process the language and make those form-meaning connections. Not that the parent is conscious of what's going on. So this can be extrapolated into one of the cornerstones of second language acquisition, which is to provide comprehensible input. And this requires a little unpacking first. By input, we mean either reading, listening text, or perhaps even watching a video. The trick is, of course, in preparing them for that input and actually giving them a reason to pay attention to it for meaning, without distracting them too much with actually focusing on language accuracy, which inhibits the process. At this point, you may be starting to have questions and wondering, oh, how can this even work within your teaching context, right? I am going to start unpacking these concepts and deconstructing them further in future videos and equipping you with the tools that you need to incorporate an acquisition-based instructional approach. The purpose of this video is to simply plant the seed and establish the principle that we can just gradually build upon together going forward. So let's recap what we have learned so far. Second language acquisition involves a very similar learning process to how we learn our first language. It is an implicit process of learning. That's to say, it's beyond the conscious mind. And by learning, we're talking about making form-meaning connections with the help of a lot of context. So this means that implicit knowledge means knowing without knowing how you know. That this particular meaning, for example, is attached to this particular form, or we could mean vocabulary, structure, tense, or even pronunciation sounds. We have also discussed that second language acquisition is facilitated by providing comprehensible input in the form of meaning-focused, not language-focused, reading and listening tasks. It is absolutely essential that learners are given time to process these texts for meaning, and they are not simply used as a stepping stone to do explicit language work, which does not facilitate language acquisition. Are you with me so far? So the emphasis on comprehensible input is absolutely key, and this is the main feature of second language acquisition. The meaning of comprehensible needs to be unpacked because it means an input that is pitched at a level just above the learner's current understanding, but given added support to make it more comprehensible. And there's a variety of ways in which that can be done. There are a lot of tools that can be used to make a slightly more difficult text more comprehensible. But it is very important to note that we don't give learners something to read and just hope for the best, or wait for the answer check. They will need a reason to read, and the instructor will have to employ strategies to compel them to understand and process the language in ways that make the target language more obvious and have the learners then show what they have understood. So this is the extent to what I wish to share in this video, but this is not the end of our discussion. We need to consider how to interpret this knowledge and how exactly we can respond to it to incorporate it more successfully into our own teaching context. So first of all, just in case you were wondering, these are not my ideas or a distortion of the research just to make me sound controversial, believe it or not. And I am deliberately leaving out a lot of academic references here just to allow the video to flow better and relate a little better to teachers with a low level of training and background knowledge, which tends to be at least half the industry. I can leave reference links in the video for those that wish to properly follow up. But I am talking about 50 years of language acquisition research at this point in time. As far as I can see from my extensive study of language learning, language acquisition is the only empirically supported, proven many times over way of explaining how languages are actually learnt. It really is that fundamental. Second language acquisition theory is generally taught on a lot of credible TEFL courses and on the Delta and MA course, but it is very rare that teachers are told what to do with this information or given any instructional strategies or tools to be able to actually apply it. Quite often you can see a real cognitive dissonance start to set in where instructors are aware of second language acquisition, but they might feel like they have to be realistic and just kind of follow the program that the school asks them to teach, not create any waves or anything or unsettle an established system. I have known some very intelligent teachers pick an older aspect of the research that has been debunked or contested and use that as an excuse to dismiss the validity of second language acquisition informed instruction as a whole. This kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I guess this kind of reaction is pretty understandable when you consider the amount of study and changing up your teaching game that an acceptance of this research would actually provoke. However, most practicing language instructors begin their teaching careers without any training that has been informed by the theory and research of second language acquisition. This is striking because if you think about it, being a language instructor that doesn't fundamentally understand how languages are learned is almost like training to be a doctor without understanding how medicine works or how the human body functions. It really is that striking when you stop to think about the real lives that are shaped by what it is we do and just how high the stakes are for them. That this essential knowledge is somehow being kind of marginalized or ignored or just not making it into the mainstream discussion. So this does behoove us to ask the question about the efficacy of our teaching methods. Don't you agree? So we're back to the question, are they really learning? How do you know? What kind of learning are we talking about? The hard truth is that if they are not acquiring language implicitly into their subconscious memory banks, their linguistic system, then for most learners who do not have a natural talent for languages, they are really not learning. Explicit language instruction for short-term testing goals might seem like they're making improvements in their tests, but this is very deceptive because we are only loading up their short-term memory for the sake of an exam, but doing nothing to respect the cognitive processes that actually support long-term proficiency. Now, I'm not judging anybody here. Language instructors are often not very well supported by their employers and have to operate in environments that do not support authentic learning. We know this. There are a lot of constraints that do work against language instructors, and I don't have time to acknowledge them all here. But assessment systems that don't align with efficacious instructional methods or respect what's happening in the average learner's mind is definitely my biggest concern. It's something that I do intend on addressing in future episodes. Added to that, and perhaps equally impactful, is the expectations that various stakeholders have. By that, I mean expectations of learners, their parents, or even the institution that you're working for. They may have a very fixed, misinformed, and sometimes downright ignorant view of what language learning should look like. It is often treated in the same way as other school subjects at school. And in language centers, there tends to be a spectrum between teaching to the test and keeping learners entertained with purposeless fun that doesn't really align with any of these learning processes. That said, a lot of incidental learning does happen. So I will be the first to admit that there are a lot of challenges, but also that none of these challenges really constitute reasons why our instruction should not be informed by, to the best extent possible, second language acquisition research. Now, if you do happen to be a Vietnamese language teacher or any other world language, then in my view, you should be absolutely immersed in understanding how second language acquisition works, because you have to operate under far fewer constraints than the English teachers and how the English assessment system is set up. This channel is for people like you, and if you stick with it, I'll keep breaking down the knowledge base that is needed to create more effective instructional strategies. If you happen to be an English teacher, then the struggle is very real, and I very much acknowledge that. I absolutely believe that there is a shift of consciousness that needs to take place, and that teachers themselves, especially Indigenous teachers, need to lead a grassroots change in how English is taught in this country. It's going to be a slow and probably a 10-year process. I'm talking baby steps here, but given all the constraints that we face, the least I feel we should be able to do is explore the scope in which teaching methods can be integrated over time and pockets of acquisition-based learning can, for now, coexist with this kind of necessary evil of having to also do more explicit teaching for short-term assessment goals, which, as you know, tend to be the measure of success in many cases. It is incumbent on all of us, instructors, to keep informed on how language learning can be done more efficiently and how best to instruct and assess. You probably don't need me to tell you that you're not going to get this by attending training workshops set up by textbook publishers or, let's say, organizations more interested in PR than equipping you with useful instructional strategies. We have to be the very autonomous, self-directed growth mindset learners that we want our own learners to become and lead by example, right? So let me end on this. Let's remember that this is a vocation, a profession, and our calling is to unlock the potential that our learners have so they can improve the quality of their lives and their families. That is our duty. Our goal needs to be not just to be good teachers, but to be second language acquisition informed teachers. Thank you for listening. Good luck out there. Please like and subscribe if you want to support this content. Bye.